All right, so let's start off by defining and explaining the existence of monopoly. So what is a monopolist? As I'm sure most of you already know, a monopolist is a single supplier, a sole supplier of a good or service for which there are no close substitutes. And so therefore the monopoly essentially constitutes the supplier for the entire industry. Okay. Quite the opposite of perfect competition, where there are lots and lots of sellers. Okay, so in fact, it's the exact opposite end of the spectrum if we're thinking of firms as being somewhere on a spectrum. Okay, so a good question then is, well, how do monopolies obtain their power? How do firms obtain monopoly power? And the answer to that question is either by creating or enjoying some kind of barrier to entry that allow the firm to make long-run economic profits. And this is in extreme contrast to what we saw with perfect competition, where perfectly competitive firms earn zero long-run economic profit. And that's mainly because there is free entry and exit, or in other words, there are no barriers to entry for new firms to enter the market. So when they see profits being made in an industry, new firms come in, that drives up supply, which brings price down, which drives the profits of all the firms in the industry towards zero. So what are these barriers to entry? Well, these are just any kind of restriction on a firm being able to start a business in that industry. Okay, so licenses that we just saw in the introduction are a type of barrier to entry. Okay, so there's several different types of barriers to entry. One type are the ownership of resources without close substitutes. So a good example of this type of barrier would be De Beers Diamond Mining Company. They essentially own roughly 95% of the world's diamond mines. And so the ownership of those resources give them a monopoly, give them monopoly power in the diamond industry. Another type of barrier is a barrier resulting from economies of scale. Okay, so recall what economies of scale means. It's when our long run, or rather the firm's long run average total cost curve is downward sloping. So a good example of this would be something like Georgia Power. Georgia Power and other types of utilities as well, like Comcast, have very large upfront costs, right? They have to build, in the case of Georgia Power, power plants, and infrastructure of power lines, very, very expensive stuff. But once that's in place, the marginal cost of providing power to another consumer, an additional consumer, is very low. In fact, it's very close to zero, which means that their average total cost just keeps getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And so they always enjoy economies of scale. They never face constant returns to scale. They never face diseconomies of scale. It's just getting cheaper and cheaper and cheaper for them to provide the product, the more people they are able to sell to. And because of this, it's very difficult for any competitors to get in and compete with them, because they would first have to incur very large upfront costs and then somehow get to a point where they serve enough customers that their average total cost is low enough to be able to compete. Okay, so that's the idea there. And then there are also legal or governmental restrictions such as licenses, patents, copyrights, trademarks. Okay, these are all government endorsed legal barriers to entry. Okay, and we'll talk about why the government might actually encourage those types of restrictions. All right, so here's another example of a firm that has that enjoys barriers to entry because of ownership of resources. The Aluminum Company of America, also known as Alcoa. I don't think this is true anymore, but at one point they owned most of the world's bauxite, which is an integral part of creating aluminum. Economies of scale, again, this is when the firm is able to enjoy such low average total costs because their average total cost just keeps declining the more people that they sell to. They're able to drive out any rivals or competitors. And so basically what ends up happening is that the largest firm gets to enjoy the lowest average total cost and can basically drive out competitors. So this is actually kind of the predatory theoretically, it's the predatory practice that Walmart has engaged in, right? They enjoy large economies of scale because of their size and their operation, and so they're able to drive down their average total cost very low, much lower than that of mom and pop shops, small businesses, and so they were able to drive them out of business. And so when this happens, although I wouldn't personally consider Walmart a natural monopoly, but when we have this type of firm enjoying extreme economies of scale, we refer to it as a natural monopoly. So these are things like Georgia Power, Comcast. Trying to think of any others that might exist. A lot of railroad companies. And it's really because of this characteristic of economies of scale, right? And so it kind of makes sense, actually, for these monopolies to exist because they are able to so drastically reduce their average total cost of production. They can really, really get the average total cost of production low. So this is actually one type of monopoly that isn't necessarily bad. Okay, so graphically speaking, this is what it would look like, right? So for a natural monopoly, here's your long-run average total cost curve here in green, and overall relevant quantities of production, average total cost is falling. And it's because their long-run marginal cost is lower than the average cost. So, and it's in fact going down as well here. So that's kind of the nature graphically of what a natural monopoly looks like. All right, here's a question to think about real quick. What if a single company acquired rights to lands containing all known deposits of all the key minerals required to produce batteries in the use of, used in powering digital devices? That firm could make all batteries in the market until new locations that contain those deposits were developed. So this company would basically constitute the entire industry for the production of batteries for digital devices, and the firm would therefore be a monopoly. Okay. Okay, now let's talk about those legal and government restrictions, barriers to entry. So like I mentioned, licenses, just like in the certified nursing assistant example and interior design example that we saw. So doctors are required to be licensed. In some states, contractors that build homes have to be licensed, although I don't think that's the case here in Georgia. Plumbers and electricians often have to be licensed. And so it's basically providing some level of proof that they can produce the work in a safe and correct manner. But this does provide a barrier to entry for other people. Franchises, same kind of thing. You cannot own and operate a McDonald's without a franchise, for example. Certificates of convenience. I'm actually not sure what those are, but I'm guessing they're similar to licenses and franchises. And so here's some examples. So electrical utilities, radio and television broadcasting. Those are okay examples. I think doctors, that's a pretty clear example. So yeah, there's some legal and government restrictions. Excuse me. I swear I don't have coronavirus. All right, let's think about a policy example real quick. There's a tombstone law that that is a grave barrier to entry in New Jersey, pun intended, I think. So the Roman Catholic Archdiocese, I think that's how you say it, of New Jersey. It's a religious leader. This archdiocese of New Jersey began to sell tombstones and mausoleums to parishioners. And in response, the Monument Builders Association of New Jersey lobbied the government for a new law that prohibited owners of private religious groups from selling cemetery tombstones and mausoleums. And the law was passed, and it constituted a legal barrier to entry into the state's market for graveside monuments. So that's pretty interesting. Another real-life example of a government-instituted barrier to entry. Here's some other legal and government restrictions. So patents. You may have heard of patents before, but this is basically a monopoly to some sort of intellectual property. So this is very common with pharmaceutical drugs, new technologies. And the idea here is that we want to give innovators and inventors an incentive to develop these technologies and new things. And they may not have that incentive if they knew that once they developed their invention, it could easily be stolen from them. So a patent prevents this, right? It says, I invented this thing, and I have the sole right as the inventor to create and sell this item, and if someone tries to copy it, I can basically sue them. So it acts as an incentive for innovation and research and development. Aside from patents, and I would actually lump in with patents, I would lump in with patents, trademarks, and copyright. So same thing with copyright, but that's for things like different written media, music, movies, those sorts of things, right? Intellectual property still there. We can also have just government regulation. So the government might say, in order to build a house, you have to get it inspected at certain points by a home inspector. That doesn't really involve a license, but it's a type of regulation that sort of prevents just any old Joe Schmo from building a house and trying to sell it to somebody. Same thing with, registering your car, for example. That's sort of, in some sense, a barrier to entry, right? No, you can't just drive around a car willy-nilly. You have to have it registered. And you have to pass emission standards and those sorts of things, right? So enforcement of safety and quality. And then there are also tariffs, which are basically just taxes on imported goods. So that acts as a barrier to entry to foreign companies, sort of protecting domestic companies here in the United States. So